The Grey Wolf by George MacDonald. One evening twilight in spring, a young English student who had wandered northward found himself on a small island called the Shetland Islands, in the outlying fragments of Scotland. He was caught in a storm of wind and hail, and it was in vain to look about for any shelter. For not only did the storm entirely obscure the landscape, but there was nothing around him except moss. He walked on for mere walking's sake, and soon he found himself at the verge of a cliff, and saw just a few feet below him a ledge of rock, where he might find some shelter from the wind. Lowering himself down by the hands towards the refugee sword, he landed on something that crunched beneath his feet, and found the bones of many small animals scattered about in front of the little cave in the rock. He went in and sat upon a stone. The storm had increased in violence, and as the darkness grew, he became uneasy, for he did not relish the thought of spending the night in the cave. He had parted from his companions on the opposite side of the island, and it added to his uneasiness that they must be worried about him. At last there came a lull in the storm, and the same instant he heard footsteps upon the bones at the mouth of the cave, stealthy and light like those of a wild beast. He started up in some fear, even though he knew there could be no dangerous animals upon the island. Before he had time to think, however, the face of a woman appeared in the opening. Eagerly, the wanderer spoke to her. She started at the sound of his voice. He could not see her well because she was turned towards the darkness of the cave. "Will you tell me how to find my way across the moor to Shinless?" he asked. "You cannot find it tonight," she answered in a sweet tone, and with a smile that bewitched him, revealing the whitest of teeth. "What am I to do then?" "My mother will give you shelter, but that's all she has to offer." "And that's far more than I expected a minute ago," he replied. "I shall be most grateful." She turned in silence and left the cave. The youth followed. She was barefooted, and her pretty brown feet went cat-like over the sharp stones as she led the way down a rocky path to the shore. Her garments were scanty and torn, and her hair blew tangled in the wind. She seemed about 25 years old. She was agile and small. Her long fingers kept clutching and pulling nervously at her skirts as she went. Her face was very grey in complexion and very worn, but delicately formed and smooth-skinned. Her thin nostrils were quivering, and her lips, whose curves were faultless, had no colour to give sign of indwelling blood. What her eyes were like he could not see, for she had never lifted her delicate eyelids. At the sandy foot of the cliff, they came upon a little hut leaning against the rock, and built around a natural hollow. Smoke was spreading over the face of the rock, and the grateful odour of food gave hope to the hungry student. His guide opened the door of the cottage. He followed her in and saw a woman bending over a fire in the middle of the floor. On the fire lay a large fish broiling. The daughter spoke a few words, and the mother turned and welcomed the stranger. She had an old and very wrinkled but honest face, and looked troubled. She dusted the only chair in the cottage and placed it by the side of the fire for him, opposite the window. Under this window there was a bench, and the daughter threw herself onto it in an unusual posture, resting her chin upon her hand. A moment after, the youth caught the first glimpse of her blue eyes. They were fixed upon him with a strange look of greed or craving, but when she realized they might betray her, she dropped them instantly. The moment she veiled them, her face, in spite of its colourless complexion, was almost beautiful. When the fish was ready, the old woman laid it on a wooden platter and invited the guest to help himself. Seeing no other provision, he pulled out a hunting knife from his pocket and divided the portion from the fish, offering it to the mother first. "Come, my lamb," said the old woman, and the daughter approached the table, but her nostrils and mouth quivered in disgust. The next moment she turned and hurried from the hut. "She doesn't like fish," said the old woman, "and I haven't anything else to give her." "She does not seem in good health," he replied. The woman answered only with a sigh, and they ate their fish with the side of a rye bread. As they finished their supper, the youth heard the sound like those of a pattering of a dog's feet upon the sand close to the door. But before he had time to look out of the window, the door opened and the young woman entered. She looked better, perhaps from having just washed her face. She drew a stool to the corner of the fire opposite him. But as she sat down, to his bewilderment and even horror, the student spied a single drop of blood on her white skin within her torn dress. The woman brought out a jar of whiskey, put a rusty old kettle on the fire as she proceeded to make some toddy in a wooden bowl. The youth could not take his eyes off the young woman. He found himself fascinated, or rather bewitched. She kept her eyes veiled with the loveliest eyelids, fringed with the darkest lashes, and he gazed interest for the red glow of the little oil lamp covered all the strangeness of her complexion. But as soon as he met a stolen glance out of those eyes, unveiled, his soul shuddered within him. Her craving eyes repulsed him. The mother placed the bowl in his hands. He drank sparingly and passed it to the girl. She lifted it to her lips, and as she tasted, she looked at him. He thought his drink must have been drugged and had affected his brain, because he saw her hair and forehead draw themselves backwards, whilst the lower part of her face projected towards the bowl, revealing before she sipped her dazzling teeth in strange prominence. But immediately the vision vanished. She returned the bowl to her mother and hurried out of the cottage. The old woman pointed to a bed of heather in one corner with a murmured apology, and the student, now weary, threw himself upon it wrapped in his cloak. The moment he lay down, the storm began afresh, and the winds blew so keenly through the crannies of the hut that it was only by drawing his cloak over his head that he could protect himself from its currents. Unable to sleep, he lay listening to the uproar which grew in violence, till the spray was dashing against the window. At length the door opened and the young woman came in, made up the fire, drew a bench before, and lay down in the same strange posture, with her chin propped on her hand and elbow and her face turned towards the youth. He moved a little, she dropped her head and lay on her face, with her arms crossed beneath her forehead. The mother had disappeared. Drowsiness crept over him. A movement on the bench roused him, as he fancied he saw some four-footed creature, as tall as a large dog, trot quietly out of the door. He was sure that he felt a rush of cold wind gazing through the darkness. He thought he saw the eyes of the damsel, but a glow from the fading fire revealed clearly enough that the bench was empty. Wondering what could have made her go out in such a storm, he fell fast asleep. In the middle of the night he felt a pain in his shoulder and immediately awoke, and saw the gleaming eyes and the grinning teeth of some animal close to his face. Its claws were in his shoulder and its mouth was seeking his throat. Before it had fixed its fangs, however, he had its throat in one hand and sought his knife with the other. A terrible struggle followed, but regardless of the tearing claws, he found and opened his knife. He made one futile stab and was drawing it for a better second attempt, when suddenly the creature twisted its neck from his hold, and making a sound like a scream mixed with a howl, it darted from him. Again he had the door open. Again the wind blew in upon him, and it continued blowing. A sheet of spray dashed across the floor and over his face. He sprung from his couch and bounded to the door. It was a wild night, dark, but for the flash of the whiteness from the waves as they broke against the sand. The wind was howling and the rain pouring down. A gruesome sound of mingled weeping and howling came from somewhere in the dark. He turned again into the hut and closed the door, but could find no way of securing it. The lamp was nearly out, and he could not be certain whether the form of the young woman was upon the bench or not. He approached it and put out his hands, but there was nothing there. He sat down and waited for the daylight. He dared not sleep any more. When the day dawned, he went out yet again and looked around. The morning was dim and gusty and grey. The wind had fallen, but the waves were tossing wildly. He wandered up and down, longing for more light. At length he heard movement in the cottage. By and by the voice of the old woman called to him from the front door. "You're up early, sir. I doubt you didn't sleep well." "Not very well," he answered. "But where is your daughter?" "She's not awake yet," said the mother. "I'm afraid, but I have a poor breakfast for you. But you'll take a dram and a bit of fish. It's all I've got." Unwilling to hurt her through hardly in a good appetite, he sat down at the table. While they were eating, the daughter came in, but turned her face away and went to the further end of the hut. When she came forward after a minute or two, the youth saw that her hair was drenched and her face whiter than before. She looked ill and faint, and when she raised her eyes, all that fierceness had vanished and sadness has taken its place. Her neck was now covered with a cotton handkerchief. She was modest and no longer shunned in his gaze. He was even thinking of breathing another night in the hut and seeing what would happen when the old woman spoke. "The weather will be broken today, sir," she said. "You better be going or your friends will leave without you." Before he could answer, he saw such a pleading glance on the face of the girl that he hesitated, confused. Glancing at the mother, he saw a flash of fury in her eyes. She rose and approached her daughter with her hand lifted to strike her. The young woman lowered her head with a cry. He darted around the table to interpose between them, but the mother had caught hold of her. The handkerchief had fallen from her neck, and the youth saw the 5 blue bruises on her lovely throat, marks of 4 fingers and the thumb of the left hand. With a cry of horror, he darted from the house, but as he reached the door, he turned, his hostess lying motionless on the floor, and the huge grey wolf came bounding after him. He had no weapon to hand, but he would never let himself harm a woman, even if she were a wolf. But his instincts took over, and he reached out his arms and hands, curved, ready to clutch it at the throat again where he had already left those marks. The creature sprung and eluded his grasp, but just as he expected to feel her fangs, he found a woman weeping on his chest with her arms around his neck. The next instant, the grey wolf broke from him and bounded, howling up the cliff. The young man followed, for it was the only way to the moor and back to his companions. All at once he heard the sound of a crunching of bones, not as if a creature was eating them, but as if they were ground by the teeth of rage and disappointment. Looking up, he saw close above him the mouth of a little cavern in which he had taken refuge the day before. Summoning all his resolution, he passed it slowly and softly. From within came the sounds of a mingled moaning and growling. Having reached the top, he ran at full speed for some distance across the moor before venturing to look behind him. When he finally did, saw against the sky the girl standing on the edge of a cliff, wringing her hands. One solitary rail crossed the space between. She made no attempt to follow him, and he reached the opposite shore safely. The end.